Yep, good.
All right. So I'm going to share with you what to include in your vertical slice. So to start off, I'll share who I am. So I'm Kelsey. I work at the Iterative Collective, which is an indie games incubator and publisher. So this is more on the publishing side of things. And this is my team from PAX East this year. I work as narrative support for our games and incubation, and I'm in charge of press and influencer outreach, and I help with general marketing stuff. But everyone on our team gets a say on whether we pick a game to work on or not. And so that means we all spend a lot of time reviewing pitch decks and vertical slices. And I get asked about vertical slices a lot. So I thought I would share that with you all today. So what is a vertical slice? So you might have heard it, you might not have heard it, but it's a famous metaphor that gets used for this is a slice of cake. So if you're going to serve me a piece of cake, how are you going to cut it? You're not going to scrape a little off the top, right? You're not going to make some strange jaggedy bit. You're going to cut the cake from the top to the bottom and give me that whole slice of cake, right? And even though I'm probably only going to have one slice of cake, I'm going to understand what the whole rest of the cake tastes like just from eating that one slice. Its textures, its flavors should be pretty consistent throughout. So from this one piece, I understand the whole. And that's what your vertical slice should be doing. So if we stick with that cake metaphor, your vertical slice should be representing each layer of your game, which we can think of as like the cake. Sorry, my dog is having a drink and shaking and making some noise in the background. We have the gameplay, the assets, the mechanics. It's kind of like the cake. And then we have the icing that holds everything together. So like the UX, UI, inventory, controls, stuff like that. Here's a graph that doesn't fit with the aesthetic of my slideshow at all, and which I stole from this site on the internet. So if you would like to visit that site and see more of their stuff, you can. But this is a good representation of how that slice should cut through each of the major aspects of your game. So a vertical slice should be a playable portion of your game that shows enough of the layers that the player, whether that's another developer you want to bring on, a publisher, an investor, they're going to be able to understand the full intended gameplay experience. So your pitch deck, which you're probably familiar with, will be making promises about what your game can be. And what your vertical slice should be doing is backing all of that up with clear, playable demonstrations that deliver to some extent on each of the promises you're making in your pitch deck. So if we want to break it down more simply, your vertical slice needs to be playable, polished, enjoyable, and representative of your entire game. So maybe you're still like, okay, but what does that mean? So maybe another way to understand what a vertical slice is to consider what it is not. It is not your first playable build. It is not your prototype. It is a build with clean quality assets, polished UI, and the ability to be played and understood and enjoyed generally in one sitting. It should also be fun, right? Because you're trying to sell the idea of your game, not for money necessarily, but to your new teammate or investor or publisher or whoever it is you want to believe in your vision of your game and to understand your ability to provide on that vision. So here are some things you should do your very best to have in your vertical slice. All my dogs are losing their minds right now. Okay, so the art, you should have the real stuff, not placeholders as much as possible. You should have UI. The navigation shouldn't be clunky or unintuitive as best as possible. Mechanics, try to include all the big ones. If your character can slow time, walk on water, and teleport, we need to probably be able to see all of that. It can be really condensed, but you want to show us all the big stuff that's going to come. For music, when's the last time you watched a movie that didn't have music? Probably never, because music really sets the mood, and it's a good idea to set the mood here in your vertical slice as well. You don't need your whole soundtrack yet, but some music to help the player understand the mood you're setting would be good. Same thing with sound design. Those little squishes and squeaks and creaks and bunches and whatever it is you have in your game are really important to immerse your player and kind of sell that gameplay. So as much of that as you can get in there is good to include. Good to have stuff, tutorials, even if it's just the explanation of what the buttons do. Controller flexibility. If you're going to let people play on controller or mouse and keyboard, let them, give them the option to do either. Speaking of options, any settings or options you can put in there for them, whatever you can allow the player to control for themselves is only going to improve their experience. Then we have something to remember. A vertical slice is the first impression of your game that a lot of people are going to see, and it's going to inform what is understood and expected of the final project. It should prove that your game is fun and interesting and has good potential. And it should also maybe demonstrate some of the issues that might come up in the future, which is a good thing because your team or investor or publisher can then help you tackle them early. So if you've successfully made whoever you're showing your vertical slice to believe in your vision, they'll want to help you, not turn you away for being honest. So you want to have a good, honest representation of your game as much as possible. So basically, your prototype answers whether you should make the game, but your vertical slice is meant to prove whether you can make this game. So that's why investors and publishers like to see it. They want to see you prove it. Proof you can do it, proof you can bake every layer of the cake that you promised. And that's really it. So you can see the full post that I've written up at my company's blog, because I write our blog posts there if you're interested. And that's all I have for my part of the presentation. So thank you for joining in.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kelsey. All right, so we're going to take a couple minutes for questions, if there are any. Again, you can either use the Q&A or ask questions in the chat. I'm actually going to throw a question out there too while we're waiting, personally. So I talk a lot about vertical slices with students and with other developers too, and there seems to be a little bit of a frustration a lot of the time when talking about vertical slices, because the idea that, like, especially because, as you mentioned, it's sort of like meant to be like kind of a selling point, right? That because we do a lot of game development in an agile cycle where everything is meant to be very iterative, the idea of having like a portion of your game that has a lot of things that typically, you know, in development we teach you're supposed to do at the end of production, like polish and things, tends to not like really fit with the idea of the vertical slice, especially because you kind of need a budget to create one, and there seems to be a lot of tension there. I was kind of curious if you could like kind of expound on like how you see that kind of from the publisher side, or if there's like any advice that you would give game developers who kind of feel that tension.
So the company I work for does incubation and publishing, which means games can come to us that are not ready to be on market yet. They can be very in development still. And so we get a lot of people who, you know, send us pitch decks and they don't have anything close to a vertical slice. And that doesn't mean we won't consider them. And it's tricky because it depends on how strong your team is, how strong the game is, how strongly we believe in your ability. So if you're not as strong, if you don't have that background, I think it's more likely that a company like mine will probably want to see a vertical slice, as frustrating as that is, because everything you said is so true. It's frustrating and difficult to kind of create this little borehole of your game that may not be, you know, fully polished yet and everything. But we often are willing to work with devs to get there. If we believe in their vision, we sometimes, that's when we'll maybe put people kind of in incubation and work with them to get to that point. And then if they want to work with us for publishing from that point on, we can talk about that. If not, we help them, you know, with funding or with whatever they might need to help get them to a point where they can make a vertical slice or something close to it that proves their ability to create the game that they're promising that they have the ability to create. But yeah, it's kind of paradoxical and it's very frustrating. And those things are true. And it's also true that just sometimes that's just people are just going to expect it of you and you can't escape it. But sometimes if you can, you know, make a really good pitch deck that shows pieces very clearly, and show as much of the gameplay as possible, even if it's not a perfect vertical slice, if you've got a playable demo, sometimes that'll do. But just not always. Sometimes you just have to get frustrated and then make this paradoxical vertical slice.
Yeah.
So I see someone ask, can you give an example or an additional explanation about including an advanced player skill or mechanic without the full progression of previous levels that teaches the player skill? Basically, how to show something the player has not had time to learn, but needs to be satisfying in the vertical slice. So that's a good question. I can't talk on specifics, but I do know we're working with a game that they kind of, there's a few ways you can do it. One game gave us almost like an accelerated gameplay. It was almost one level that sort of gets really hard really quickly. So instead of giving the player as much time and space as you'd like for them to have in the real game to like learn a new mechanic, what they kind of did is they pared it down to like a small sampling. And what it did is they just expected that hopefully we would enjoy those early easier moments, that we would spend some more time and learn the harder ones and play through. And that worked for this game. Sometimes people create a vertical slice that's closer to like a first level where they're just kind of teaching the skills and giving little, activities to use the skills on, but they're not necessarily kind of pulling you through the game and like moving you through all the different places in the game and things like that. So it really depends. It's really hard because all games are different. The one that kind of smushed everything down, it made sense for them to kind of create this like accelerated pace because you could spend as much time as you wanted sort of playing around with that first skill and then move to the second and move to the second. But I think in the end, it really depends on what you think is most effective to show from your game and how you want that player experience to be in this vertical slice. Maybe you want to show that it starts easy and gets really hard, and the people playing it are going to have a lot of experience trying out games and understanding that and understanding what you're saying with that. But if you're pretty sure that's not going to be an enjoyable experience, you can approach it a different way and maybe set up something more instructive for someone to play and try the different ways. But it's a tricky needle to thread, quite frankly, to show kind of that early game and end game sort of situations without just frustrating a player in, the few minutes that they're going to play. I would say, at least in our team, we have a lot of experience trying lots of different demos and vertical slices and stuff. And I feel like we're pretty good at understanding what devs are trying to say to us, even when something might not be, we can understand, oh, this is really hard, but I see where they're going. I see what they're saying. I see what they're showing us. And maybe do the best you can to show as much as you can while also hopefully having faith that the people you're showing it to will understand what you're trying to communicate with them. And if it has promise, but we're a little confused about it, or, we weren't sure quite what you were trying to say, if we liked it even a bit, we're going to communicate with you and talk with you about it. So keeping those lines of communication open can be helpful. Adding in something like a pitch deck or an explanation that helps players understand what you're trying to do with your vertical slice can help. But the truth is, while I did talk with my bosses and say, what do you guys think we should include here? There's no one right singular way to make a good vertical slice. And it's always going to be up to, what your game is and what your goals are.